Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Canadian Story. I'm joined by my old friend Micah. Well, old in the longevity of our friendship, not old as in aged.
That's correct.
So Micah and I worked on Parliament Hill together in a number of different capacities, but our last jobs together where we both worked for Shelley Glover, the Minister of Heritage at the time. And then we've kept in touch and remained friends and had some business ventures together and worked on campaigns. And one of the things that we've been talking about for years now, actually, Micah, I think you were one of the first people to really push this into my awareness, was precious metals and inflation and kind of the role that you see precious metals playing in the future economic makeup of, wealth. And I know people talk about this a lot, and it's kind of a common theme, but especially for Canada, one of the biggest producers of gold and silver in the world, and mining being such an important industry for us, I thought it would be great to have you on the show to talk about these things and talk about inflation and your silver thesis, and also just for you to share with the listeners what you love about Canada.
Great. Okay, so should I start with that or a little bit about myself?
No, sorry, a little bit about yourself first, yes.
Okay, so Parker and I, we go back to, I don't know, is it 2010 or really, I think, crossing paths the first time in 2009 maybe?
Yeah, probably 2009.
Yeah, so look, I was born in Golden, BC, which is a small town. My dad worked for the railway. Him working for CP eventually brought us to Ontario. I lived there for 20 years, the last 10 of which were in Ottawa. 6 of those years were spent on the Hill. And I've been back on the coast now for 5 years, and I'm the proud dad of 2 young girls, married to my beautiful wife. And then I've got several projects. You kind of hit it on the head. I've been a absolute nut for the precious metals. I'm a silver bug. I'm a gold bug too, but silver, and we'll get into that, is going to be really one of the most amazing assets to watch this decade. And as you know, I'm also a political junkie, have organized and run many campaigns, and I've got a cool little political project too that I'm involved with now. And so, look, I think Canada, and part of my real admiration for the country came from when Harper was our prime minister, the things that he would say. And I still believe, although I have less sort of optimism for the future now, is that Canada has been a bastion of light and hope for countries across the world, and for people to come here and truly live a quality of life better than they could anywhere else. And I do think that Canada is the most bountiful and beautiful country there is. But I am concerned that we are going to experience probably some of the worst times for our country ahead of us, and in particular this next decade. I think there's a looming sovereign debt crisis, not just here in Canada, but for the whole G20. And I think what we have basically coming down the pike economically is pretty much going to be unexpected and unexperienced by any living person today. Anyone who lived through the Great Depression has passed on. I think we have the greatest depression, unfortunately, coming up for our generation. But, on the other side of that, I'd like to be sort of on a lighter note to say that it will probably look much better than it does now. And there are sort of bright futures for everybody in Canada, I hope, after we get through this crisis. So not to belabor that too much, but
no, I think that's good. I mean, Zach can speak to this a bit, but on the Canadian story, we tend to try to be positive. But I think it's important. We have episodes where we talk about like Alberta separatism and kind of the regional issues, or kind of what's happening in our education system. So we don't want to shy away from topics that are more intense. And that's a big reason I wanted to have you on, because I think there's an underlying understanding now. People are becoming aware of what you're talking about. Like, we're now seeing inflation over 5%. Which is absolutely absurd and nothing we've seen in our lifetimes. Maybe I guess they saw it in the 70s, but other than that, it was very rare. So in your, like, and I agree with what you're saying about a sovereign debt crisis. Can you walk the listeners through, because they're not very, not everyone has a background in this stuff. How does sovereign debt get accumulated? How is it created? And why is that a problem?
Okay, so it hasn't really been an issue for the last 40 years. Like you said, coming out of the 1970s, which was a very inflationary decade, in particular for commodities, that led to, I track mostly the Fed, because what the Fed does, the Federal Reserve in the US, pretty much is what we're going to end up doing eventually. But if you look at what happened in the 80s, and if you talk to your parents, they had 15% interest rates on their house mortgage. They had 18% car loans. That was because coming out of an inflationary decade, the Fed had to have high interest rates to basically snuff out inflation and to get the economy back up to par so that things could cool down. So we have seen basically a doubling of the debt in every single presidency since Reagan. And in Canada, with Harper having balanced the budget, however briefly, in 2015, we are going to see $1 trillion deficit probably before we have another prime minister, is my view. We're pretty close to that. I think we're in the 400 billion or 350 billion, but it will be $1 trillion, and we will break that benchmark with Trudeau as prime minister.
Which is for everyone, so everyone knows, that is a doubling of the debt under Trudeau. More than a doubling, I think. More than
a doubling. Well, he inherited a basically balanced budget. His first year, I think he had a $30 billion deficit. And during COVID and the whole COVID crisis, we've now 10x'd the national debt in Canada to beyond 300 billion. But more broadly, we've been in a credit expansion for the last 40 years, essentially growing debt and lowering interest rates in order to service that debt has been the norm for the last 40 years. Now, the government has printed a lot in order to get us through the COVID crisis, and not as much. Harper was in a similar situation in 2009-10 when he had to get us out of the great global financial crisis in 2008. He also basically went into debt to bail out the economy. The difference between what Harper did and what Trudeau is doing is Harper's stimulus was aimed at making our economy and certain industries more competitive, and at providing them with tax credits and tax advantages to sort of get ahead and to boost the economy and to get us back to a recovery mode where we could stabilize the economy. Trudeau has essentially gone into all this national debt in order to create programs that maintain people's incomes. So the difference is Trudeau has printed money to go into people's pockets, and Harper printed money basically giving back money through tax credits to make our industry more competitive. And so the reason we're seeing inflation now versus why we didn't see it in the early 2010s is because of that exact point, as well as that we are seeing the flow through of the creation of money going into sort of the retail or the front lines of people's incomes and people's pockets, which is now being immediately spent on all these different goods and services. Add to that all the different supply chain issues. We have seen the price of things go up considerably. So I don't know if that answers your question that directly, but I'd like to sort of point this quick fact out. Prior to 2003, the definition in pretty much any given dictionary for inflation was the issuance of government currency, basically the creation of money. Now it's more generally conceived of as the steady rising price of goods and services and assets. So the price of things going up.
Yeah,
but it's
true.
it's not that the price of things are going up. It's that the purchasing power of the dollar is going down. So you need more dollars to buy the same things. And that is because they're creating more dollars. So essentially, by injecting more money into the system, they are creating inflation.
And doesn't that have a lot to do with, I've always thought of it this way, that a thing's value is basically in its rarity, right? So something's going to be, the more you have something, less valuable it seems to you. So for example, as civilizations, we used to trade like beads and like things like that. But once we figured out modern manufacturing practices, beads became common. You could make a bead very easily. It's that Adam Smith pin situation, right? Where it could take one man an entire day to make a pin, but it could take 10 men a day to make a million pins, right?
Yeah.
But similarly, so the problem, of course, is that this is a basic law of supply and demand. The more you have of something, the less valuable it is. This is like gravity. This isn't some complex, crazy way of thinking. It's the more we have of something, the less valuable it's going to be in comparison with things that have tangible value.
Right. So you're right. Basically, currency has really two functions. It is to allow to have a transactable unit, to basically allow for the exchange of goods for services and to have a way of transacting with people. But it's also supposed to be scarce enough that it has that sort of intrinsic value. That's what you're talking about, right? Yeah. Where it's people have confidence in that form of currency because it is scarce and because it does hold value. And because of that, people are willing to transact in that particular currency, whether it be, wampum or beads or silver coin or fiat currency. So there's a quote that I really like from, of all people, JP Morgan, which is, gold is money, everything else is credit. And coming from the guy who, founded one of the founding fathers of the Fed, but also who founded, probably one of the most corrupt banks, who's actually been charged criminally for suppressing, manipulating precious metals markets. Gold and silver have been money for over 5,000 years. Everything else is credit. In particular now, more than ever at any point in time, all of the world's 180 plus countries are all on a fiat currency system. It's the first time ever. And Voltaire says that fiat currencies in time all return to their intrinsic value, which is zero. And what's a major ingredient that's required in order for fiat currencies to go back to zero is a loss of confidence. And I think we're a ways away from that, but that's what credit is. Credit is all about confidence. Like if they're going to, increase your credit limit on your credit card, it's because they're confident that you can pay it back. They're willing to give you more credit because they know you have an income that can actually pay that down. Well, if people lose confidence in the dollar as a unit of monetary value, something that holds its value and something that therefore is somewhat scarce and can be confidently traded for goods and services, then the whole thing falls apart. And like I said, I think we're a few years away from that now. I do think we're probably going to see a general consensus and lack of confidence, sort of like mid to the end of the decade. But in the meantime, we've got this thing, inflation, which is starting to wake people up. Well, what is inflation? Why are we having inflation? And back to my earlier point, it's because of all the money that they've printed and the way that they've actually injected it into the economy this time versus past times. But there is a delay. There is a delay between injecting all this money and actually seeing the inflationary effects. In January of 2021, the Fed was actively trying to get inflation up above 2%. You can go back and see transcripts of any FOMC meeting or any Fed meeting. Jerome Powell was actively engaged in trying to get inflation up above 2% because that was healthy for the economy and whatever. So they were trying to get it up. Then all of a sudden in May of 2021, CPI printed 4.5%. So literally 4 times from January. And then he said, oh, this is not inflationary, or this is
transitory.
Is transitory. And look, I actually think that he is not lying about the transitory part, and I'll get there in a sec. But they went from it's not high enough to now, it's here, but it's not going to be here for a long time, to now they're saying, well, it's here, it's worse than we thought, and we have to think that it's probably going to do us some good. They're talking about record employment, which is true. Wages aren't necessarily keeping up, especially here in Canada, which is not good. And inflation is actually generally horrible for middle and lower income classes because it's a tax on everything. It's a major tax on all the money that is spent. And without wages kind of going up in sync, you end up with stagflation, where wages are stagnant, but the price of everything is running away from you. And when you have an interest rate set by the central bank that's in the range of 1%, but CPI or lower, and CPI is 5 or 6%, you actually have a negative real rate. Like your interest rate at that point is negative because you have to deduct CPI from the.
And this is an important point, right? Like it's important to understand now that the reason banks still make money is because they're lending out 10 times the amount they have in there. So like the realized interest rate on your dollar in a bank, even if it's at 1%, could still be 10%. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to, like, basically banks are losing their profitability. The profitability of keeping money anywhere is declining. Like, why would you keep fiat currency in your bank account if every year the bank is like essentially, like, if you have a loan with the bank, they're paying you?
Yeah. Well, so the central banks have actually been providing basically 0% interest on major loans to other banks, basically like the big 5 in Canada, but also Wall Street firms and banks in the US at pretty much 0%. They're re-lending those 0% loans in credit cards to people at 22%, 24%. But to your point, I mean, if the Fed rate or the interest rate is 1% or less, and even now on a 30-year bond, you've got a 1 or 2% yield, which if that's all you can expect for locking your money up for 30 years, what's the point of even holding that?
Yeah.
And so we are in this place in time where they went from wanting to create inflation to now saying it won't be around for a long time, to now trying to convince us that it's good for us and it's good for the economy. They, at some point, as CPI prints higher and higher, and that's my expectation probably going into the spring, that's what you call runaway inflation, where CPI, which by the way is a very skewed metric. If you actually look at commodity inflation, it's above 15%. CPI is an equation that underweights things with faster rates of change. but it
Like
also
housing.
it doesn't include housing. Doesn't
That's
even
what I mean.
underrate
It
housing.
doesn't like
Oh, yeah.
it's not rating something that's having a pretty big impact on people's lives, but it's not even being included.
Of course. Well, yeah, we can get into the whole affordability piece and housing and how this all sort of ties together. But without going into that, housing, energy, food, the biggest rates of change are all in those assets, all in those categories. They aren't even in CPI. And then again, everything else that's in CPI, the faster it's going up, the more it's underweighted in the overall formula. So I actually think inflation is over 10%. Commodity inflation's 15 to 20, but we say that CPI is 6. But we are either going to allow inflation to run away, or we are going to try to catch up by raising rates. And when we tried to raise rates last, which was in 2018, we had what's called the taper tantrum in markets where, I don't know if you remember, but markets sold off basically 20% going right into Christmas Eve.
It was like the biggest crash we've had since, or like we haven't had a crash like that since.
Well, there was COVID. There was definitely COVID.
That's true. That's true. That's
20%. But that was a policy error. But here's the thing. This is where I don't think people realize because of the 40-year credit expansion and because of essentially central bank policies, the 2008 crash probably should have been much, much, much worse. But by lowering rates and expanding the money supply, they essentially kept a bunch of businesses and sectors in the economy afloat artificially. Now, over the last 13 years, a lot of those businesses have been essentially self-cannibalizing by taking out more debt to buy back their shares, to show that there's an increase in the share price or a consolidation of the shares, which increases its value. And that essentially is them showing, hey, look, our shareholders, we can show you a return on your investment. But they have been borrowing in order to buy their own shares back. They actually don't have increased profits. Profitability is at almost an all-time low. The real economy is in tatters because of COVID, but everywhere, everyone's over-leveraged. Corporations are over-leveraged. People are over-leveraged. The housing market, household debt, it's really interesting. And I do think that when they decide to raise rates to keep up with inflation, which is, I think, probably sometime in the spring, they will pop the bubble, I think, in housing and in financial markets, because companies are going to be less profitable than they are, which isn't very much right now, because their cost
is going up. Their cost of debt's going up.
Debt will go up. So you will get probably a market sell-off, a financial market sell-off, and then it'll have its sort of rippling effects on the economy with people losing their jobs and all this other stuff. And if people lose their jobs and can't afford the mortgages on their homes, which they're over-leveraged on, you're very likely going to end up with this glut of inventory, which I think will eventually end up driving down the price of real estate. Now, certain places in Canada, like Vancouver, where I live, there's other factors at play, like supply and demand. Like there aren't that many places to build, which means there's very low inventory, which is why prices have continued to go up. But we just sold our house in North Vancouver because I do not want to own a home in what's coming.
Yeah.
And so when they say that inflation is transitory, I believe that is true, because we are going to have hyperinflation toward the end of the decade. We are experiencing inflation right now, but I think that they are going to cause a massive deflationary bust, and they will trigger what I refer to as the greatest depression when they pop the bubble, the everything bubble. It's financial markets. People with leverage in the stock market now is like unheard of with Robinhood and all this stuff. It's the housing market. It's financials. It's the financial markets. It's major corporations. Basically, right now we have overvalued assets everywhere you look, except the metals.
Okay, and then why, let's go into that. Why not the metals? Why have they not inflated to the same degree? And why is silver the play of the century, probably?
Yeah, one of them. So I'll back up a little bit. They have certainly, they typically lead a little bit, and gold tends to lead the metals. So if you go back to 2017, 2018, you actually pretty much saw that even then the metals were undervalued. But you know, this is when I first started buying silver at $14 an ounce. Today we're at 24 and change. We were up at 30 in August of 2020, and it flew to 30 from $13 in the COVID crash. Here's the thing is, the metals are highly manipulated. Now, a lot of people don't want to believe that there's this big nefarious scheme to suppress the price of the precious metals. I tend to understand what the claims are, but I don't want to put too much weight on them. The metals will outperform, and actually commodities will outperform, in general, will outperform this decade. But the metals are, like I said earlier, they are money. And we are going to look back on this sovereign debt crisis when we're on the other side of it. And my kids, I think, are going to go, we can't believe that you guys transacted in a worthless fiat paper monopoly money for like 50 years, really. I mean, Canada's a different story. Canada has not been on the gold standard since 1929. The start of the Great Depression. The U.S. has not been on the gold standard since 71, when Nixon took them off of it.
So really quickly, I want to clarify something there.
Yeah, Zach, please.
Do you feel, so you think we're going into the Greater Depression, which is lovely. Do you think, the world or countries come out of that on the other end and go back to a precious metal backed currency, or do we stay fiat? What's your prediction?
Yeah.
Is there utility to going back to precious metals?
I think people will realize that 50 years or 50 plus years of transacting globally in fiat was not a good idea, because expanding the money supply and basically allowing the central banks to have monetary policy and to print an infinite amount of dollars was a complete mistake. And I think, to sort of jump ahead, I guess, that gold and silver will have a massive revaluation on the other side. I think we're going to have, it's actually quite a dystopian view of things, and I didn't plan on getting into it now, but I guess I might as well. Back to this sovereign debt crisis. It's not just Canada, it's not just the US. The entire G20 has one of two options right now. They can either default on their debt, or they can try to inflate it away. Inevitably, they will default on their debt when the currency has become worthless. So we're not there yet. We're probably there in 5 years or so, maybe a little bit more. When that happens, and they eventually, and the US is actually pretty close to this right now, not having enough income from tax receipts to actually pay the interest on the debt. Yeah. And now that is actually the definition of bankruptcy, not having enough income to pay the interest on your loans. But they can always print more money to ensure that they have money to pay the interest. They're just going to worsen the inflationary or hyperinflationary effects down the road. And that's why they're in such a jam. But what I think happens is The G20 will have a sovereign debt crisis pretty much across the board. Everyone's economies are going to be absolutely like when I say the Greatest Depression, I truly mean it. No one is prepared. Like Weimar Germany, where the currency failed and people are wheelbarrowing banknotes to go and buy bread. I don't think we're going to end up in a situation like that because most of our money is digital. But we are going to end up with people not wanting to transact in dollars, and it'll end up being a complete disaster. The way that ends is, and you can see this already, every central bank in the world, save for Canada and the US, have been buying gold hand over fist for years in preparation for what's going to happen. They know what's coming. And that is basically attested to in the fact that, and I talked earlier about price suppression of the metals. The big banks are all short, and they're short so they can basically suppress the price. But they want to suppress the price, and they're allowed to get away with it, even though the SEC has shown time and time again, week after week, flagrant price manipulation of the metals. They are extending their buying window for central banks to purchase gold, because ultimately when everyone is in a sovereign debt crisis, it's the IMF or the World Bank that will likely swoop in and say, we will absolve the G20 of their debt. We will basically have a debt jubilee. Everyone's debt gets wiped. And you are going to come on to they're already talking about this, a World Bank digital currency, and it will be backed by, I think it'll be bimetallic. I think it'll be backed by gold and silver. But even if it's just backed by gold, you will have a massive revaluation of both metals. That's why they're buying it hand over fist. That's why the government's allowing the price manipulators to get away with it, because most of them can buy it.
They're shorting it at the same time that they're buying it.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because they know where. Well, actually, it's interesting to me that Russia now has more gold than they've ever had in their history, I believe. Like Russia's sitting on a lot of gold.
China doesn't report their gold reserves, nor do they allow any of their gold to be exported. A lot of people talk about the next currency being a digital or a gold-backed digital yuan. I think that that's possible, but I do basically think that a massive global sovereign debt crisis will lead to the consolidation and adoption of a singular sort of universal digital currency unit that will then be backed. And this is where it's very scary for Canada. You will have a portion of that new digital currency issued to your country that is proportional to your gold reserves. We have zero.
I think you were saying to me last night, Micah, you're like, I have more gold in my closet right now than the country has in reserve.
Exactly. And it's kind of a joke, but it shouldn't be. It's very scary. We are going to be holding the bag as a country that has absolutely no gold reserves. And here's the thing, the price of gold in dollars is sort of pointless when the actual value of that money unit is going to go to zero. So like I tell folks, $10,000 or $20,000 an ounce gold is completely in the realm of possibility in the next 5 or so years, call it 5 to 10 years. But its value in a currency that eventually is going to completely be obliterated by the central bank and government policies itself is useless. What you want to have it for is that it will be revalued in that next currency or in that next financial system, whatever it looks like. It will provide you with the insurance of knowing that it's worth something in whatever comes next. But between now and then, we are going to have to go through the horrible time of seeing the effects of bad monetary policy finally come down. I think that the house of cards that narrowly avoided falling down or crashing down in 2008 has only been made taller and more unstable and worse. It's like a hangover. We should have gone through this cathartic, complete
like kind of like a warm bath and, you know, reflected on our day.
No, more like it should have been a savage wildfire that crisped
Right.
half of the economy.
Right.
But instead, we allowed it to continue and to get where is, like I said, it's like a hangover where you have to wake up and feel the absolute pain of 40 years of credit expansion without actually allowing yourself to go through a proper cycle of purging the bad businesses, purging bad sectors, of allowing the redistribution of sort of value within the economy. We have just artificially sedated everyone with cash and low interest rates. And we basically have just been, you know, drinking more and taking more drugs and doing this to keep the high going and not wake up and feel shitty. Well, right. I'm sorry, but now we basically are going to go tits up when we eventually do wake up from our from the night of partying.
Like we're going to need we're going to be going through withdrawal now because we were.
Oh, we have to go through it. So again, we can just keep delaying it, but it is an absolute necessity. And it's unfortunate that our generation is going to end up getting saddled with dealing with that. There's an amazing book by Neil Howe and William Strauss called The Fourth Turning. And
yes, that is a great book.
I just read it. Yeah.
There you go. So we are in a fourth turning. Yeah. And for your listeners and people who haven't read it, essentially what it says is throughout history, there are these periods of time, mostly equivalent to the average human life. It's about 80 to 100 years. And they call that period of time a saeculum. So a saeculum is a chunk of time equivalent to the average human life, 80 to 100 years. Each saeculum has 4 parts and 4 chapters or 4 turnings. And the first turning is usually quite good, quite optimistic, and people feel really, really, really great coming out of it. The first turning of the saeculum we're in now was when all the boomers were born and was post-World War II. But then let's go back to the fourth turning of the saeculum prior to the saeculum that we're in now. The fourth turning ended with the Second World War. Now, the 2 authors, who one's deceased and one now is still quite active in promoting the message of the book and in dealing with sort of, you know, macroeconomics and where we're at, he predicted things like financial crisis and pandemics and all of these things that were social unrest and civil war. And we are starting to see some of that now. And by his measure in his book, which was written in 1997, about mid-decade, this decade is when we really experienced the crisis, which lines up with my view, my macro sort of economic view of where we're at. But so they say that everyone's life should be better than their parents, right? And as a parent, you want your kid's life to be a little bit better than yours. I think that our kids are actually going to have a worse time than we had for the first time in a saeculum. And that is because of what they have to go through or what they're going to have to grow up in, and which is the result of, you know, these things are inevitable. They don't always end in financial crisis, but this one was definitely made worse by policymakers and central bankers.
Well, do you think it's one of those things where it is actually, like you said, these things are cyclical and we can impact how bad they're going to be based on how forward thinking we are? We haven't been forward thinking about this at all.
Sorry, which brings me back to the metals. Go ahead, Zach. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we woke up with hair of the dog instead of dealing with the hangover.
Yeah, over and over again for years.
Over and over.
But so that's where I refuse to allow my kids to live a worse life than me. And I am preparing for it. I'm one of the few that are. And I urge all of you to prepare for what's happening. And that's sort of, sorry, Parker, I'm realizing now I never got into the metals and why I like them so much.
We have some
we'll time. Do that now, but that's where and why they're so important. And maybe let's get into that now. So again, the metals have been money and they will be money. They will be money in what's next. If we have a bimetallic backed central
or Bitcoin.
digital
People will
currency.
buy a gold with Bitcoin because gold is still gold.
Totally. And look, I actually think that Bitcoin and all the cryptos are on the same team as gold and silver. We are on the sound money side of the equation. We want sound money, sound monetary policy, a safe and stable currency that is backed by something and is not so elastic it can just be inflated to infinity and therefore cause all these problems we're experiencing now. We want a sound monetary system that is backed by
reality. We want a connection to reality. We want our economics to have something to do with people's lives.
Yeah, the problem with the cryptos, and the reason I don't own any, and I say I don't own any yet, I will likely buy some in the bust, which I think is coming in 22. But I think that the cryptos, they're already talking about regulating them and criminalizing them. Some central banks, like El Salvador, has adopted Bitcoin as an actual form of it, but they're the exception to the rule. The ECB, the Fed, the Bank of England, they're all talking about having their own coins. And I think that there will be one, and it'll probably come from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. I don't want to own cryptos because I think they're more easily regulated, but I think that, yeah, if not made outright like criminal, but I also think that they're going to be harder to access in what's coming because you need power, you need internet. And I'm not trying to be like a gloom and doomer, but I think in what's coming, there will be power outages. There will be.
There is right now, Micah. If you're living in Europe right now.
Oh, well, I'm in BC. My power went out yesterday. But luckily, and I'm very sorry for all the people in the interior who have had their homes washed out. I mean, there are floods everywhere. And so I think, sort of with what's coming financially or on the economic side of things, we'll probably experience more sort of disasters like this one, natural disasters as well, which makes it worse. And that's what scares me about not being able to access my digital wallet, right?
Yeah. What are you going to do?
Yeah. If I can run around with a tube of silver coins and transact privately with people who also don't want to transact in dollars and will sell me food or a truck or whatever I need in precious metals, then no one wants to lug around like 60 pounds of silver in their backpack. But
silver's going to be worth a lot more at that point because people are going to want to transact in real things, I would think.
Yeah, and I have most of mine vaulted in high security private vaulting services, which are outside of the banking system. And so anyway, silver and gold. Silver in particular is highly undervalued for a few reasons. It has really 4 major tailwinds going for it. The same can be said for some of these for gold, but silver really is an exception. It is, I believe, the most undervalued asset on the planet. It is half the price in 2021 that it was in 1980. It has an all-time high of $50. It was touched twice. It was touched in 1980. It was touched in 2011. And we are going to touch that 50 mark again, I think, in the next 6 months as this inflationary narrative sort of takes hold. But I think that we're going to see triple digits in the next 2 years. And I actually have price projections. I do some technical analysis that puts silver probably in the $500 range per ounce in the next 5 years.
Which that's just for everyone's knowledge, that's a 10x right there.
Yeah. So what is it currently an ounce?
$24. All of these, when I mention any prices, they're in USD, which is the currency in which they trade on the COMEX. But 24 something today, and $50 is the all-time high. And again, I think we're taking out 50 probably in the next 6 months or sooner. If you take that 1980 high of $50 and you actually index it in today's dollars, it's like $650. The other interesting fact, the 4 tailwinds. So you've got really 4 things going for silver. One is it's a counter-cyclical. So when the stock markets sell off, people go risk off. instead of risk on. And that risk off means you don't want to be in the risky stock market. You want to be in those age-old, time-tested stores of value. You're not looking to make a bunch of money. You're just looking to protect your money. So that counter-cyclical factor will be huge when the market sells off, and we do.
Because we're already in the biggest, I believe it's the biggest bull or the longest bull market in
history, or maybe not history, but it's 13 years and running, minus these sort of 20% corrections. But I mean, mark my words here and now, I think we will put in a high watermark on the stock market that won't be ever reached again. Similar to Japan in like 88, 89, it didn't actually just re-reach those 1988 highs until a couple of years ago, which is 30 years. We will put in a high watermark on financial markets, and sorry, where was I going with that? Oh yeah,
well, so the four tailwinds. So basically, you're saying it's counter-cyclical, and then I went into
that's one.
We're in a major bull run,
So we're probably going to see, and again, I was saying, mark my words, we're probably going to see a high watermark and at least a 50% correction in indices. 50, not 15, 50. That's my minimum target.
And then how soon do you anticipate that?
It'll start sometime in 2022. Mm-hmm. Once they basically make a policy error and trigger the popping of the bubble with interest rate hikes and tapering. Their hand will be forced there. So they're counter-cyclical, number one. Two, they're an inflation hedge, which is actually separate from being a counter-cyclical to the markets, because you have sell-offs in the markets that are good for the metals, whether you're in inflation or deflation, but they're a hedge for currency failure. So people are going to want to do what I'm telling you guys to do, which is invest in it, knowing that it'll be worth something in 10 years when the dollar is not.
Yes.
So they're an inflation hedge. But industrial demand is also expected to grow by 80% in the next 5 years. Silver's
batteries,
solar, wind, EVs. It's used in everything for its conductive properties.
Medical equipment.
Exactly, for its antibacterial properties. So it is going to go up in terms of industrial demand by 80% over the next 5 years. Meanwhile, the fourth tailwind is mining supply is down and will continue to go down from a lack of investment over the last 10 years, and because they just aren't finding any major deposits. We are just basically scrounging up and becoming more effective in existing deposits, but they haven't found any new major silver deposits anywhere in the world. They are just extracting more out of the mines that exist. So those four things are a perfect storm for silver's price to go absolutely bonkers. Now, gold and silver are both going to go up, but relative to gold, silver is much more volatile, and she will go up far faster, but she also is more volatile, so she goes down faster as well. But right now, the gold to silver ratio is about 75. That means 75 ounces of silver equals 1 ounce of gold. Throughout monetary history, the average is probably 15. But if you go back to like Egyptian times, it was literally a 2 to 1. And for a lot of monetary history, it was below 10. It was 120 to 1 in March of 2020 during the COVID crisis. So what that means is like 75 ounces today gets you 1 ounce of gold. But I think we're going to see a return to the historical average. And if we don't get to 15, I think we'll at least get to 20 over the next 3 to 5 years. And what that
means
is
a tripling from its price just for it to get to that point, not even talking about anything we've talked about up to this point.
Well, that means basically, like, if gold were not to move at 1,800 and change, silver would triple. But the thing is, they're both going to go up like crazy. It's just that the rate of growth or the increase will be far, far more significant for silver. So that means that like 4 or 5 years from now, you're going to have 75 ounces of silver and you are going to get 4 ounces of gold instead of 1.
Yeah.
And this is a strategy I recommend to lots of people, is that you can actually grow your precious metals portfolio by simply just playing the GSR, the gold to silver ratio. So you convert your silver into gold when the GSR is low, and then you take your gold and you convert it to silver when the GSR is high. And you could not add you could not add a penny to your metals portfolio. If you started with, let's say, $100,000, you could grow it to, over $1 million, not by adding another penny or without prices going up, if you just played that GSR. And so right now I'm hyper focused on silver. I want to own as much gold at the end of the day as I can, but you'll do that by owning silver now as opposed to gold.
Because of that ratio difference right now.
So I tell everybody, invest in silver now and monitor the GSR over the next few years. I suspect in 2 to 5 years, you'll get down to that 20 mark. And that's when you turn it into gold and you do that conversion play. So most undervalued asset in the world. I think truly, other than some other commodities, like I think oil and gas have done well. They're going to get wrecked in the bust that's coming, but they will bounce back. Along with other commodities, uranium, natural gas, and the metals are...
Well, natural gas, we're seeing just an insane run right now.
I know, and I think that they're putting in close to a top probably this next little bit here, and then way down in the deflationary bust that comes once we get rates hiked. But here's why we're going to get hyperinflation. Sorry, I didn't really explain. We have inflation now, we're going to have hyperinflation later, but in between, we have to go through this deflationary period. The money they printed to get us out of the COVID crisis is what's causing inflation. The money that they're going to print in the next bust is nowhere near what they printed during COVID. It is going to be multiples and multiples of what was printed during COVID will be printed to get us out of the next economic
that's just to maintain the status quo. That's what they're going to be trying to do, is just not let everything fall apart.
Well, they're going to throw money at everything in the next bust. They're going to have helicopter money. They're going to have UBI. They're going to have literally, it's going to be full-blown MMT, both here in Canada and in the US and across the whole.
Yeah, for those who don't know, that's modern monetary theory, which is the kind of this new way of thinking that people have latched onto in certain economic circles, claiming that money isn't even real, basically.
Yeah, and that currency issuance doesn't cause inflation, and that creating money, as long as it goes into people's hands, is fine. But they are conveniently neglecting the confidence piece. And
they're neglecting the fact that money's supposed to be a store of value.
Right.
It's not just a means of exchange. It's supposed to be a store of value.
I mean, look at it this way. If you just take all the money units that are out there in circulation, like the money supply, either in Canada or in the US, and you divide it by the amount of investable ounces of gold you have, you get a number. And they in the US expanded the money supply by over 20% in 2020 alone through COVID. Did gold see that 20% jump in price? Yeah, it actually did. It went from 1,500.
Oh, did it? It did see it.
It went from 15 something in March to 2,100 in August of 2020, but now it's been back down, consolidating. This past year, we've had sort of a congestive, consolidated period, and I think we're going to break out to the upside out of it quite soon. But so for the metals, like I said, I think that no one's awake to it now. You always want to be, I think there will be a bubble in metals at one point. I do, but I do think that that's probably toward the end of the decade, or, before, just after this, this restructuring of the global financial system. It is probably not the best way to just preserve your wealth, but like your buying power. But silver in particular is going to be explosive. And when I say I expect a 5 to 20 times in the price of physical silver, right? That's the spot price of silver to hold like a 1 ounce bar or a 1 ounce coin. Okay.
Yeah.
But when the miners see a doubling of, and in particular, the junior miners, the junior explorers, miners and producers in the mining sector, if the price of the metal doubles, they will 3 to 5 times. That's the majors. The juniors will 10 to 20 times, some even 40 or 50 times or 100 times. It's literally like buying a lottery ticket, like buying junior miners right now for 5 cents a share or 10 cents a share. Some of these things will be worth $4, $5, $10 in the next few years. And so The safest asset to own, because this isn't financial advice, I don't encourage you to go out and start buying a bunch of junior miners. They are highly risky, they are highly volatile, they can go to zero. But something that will never go to zero are the physical metals.
Yeah.
And I do think that physical metals being a core piece of anyone's portfolio moving forward is huge. I mean, I told my dad, I want you to take 10% and invest it in the metals, both physical and the miners. And I looked at him straight in the face and I said, that 10%, I guarantee you in the next 5 years is going to be worth in the other 90. And I'm sorry for that. And I'm sorry for that. But I'm dead serious. And so I think basically that typical portfolio of the 60-40 stock to bond, 70-30 stock to bond that any financial advisor has one of our parents in, those guys are going to get absolutely annihilated. I do not want to own government debt going into a sovereign debt crisis. Again, in the shorter term, bonds might actually do okay in the bust, but ultimately, governments are going to default on their debt. And if they don't, they're just going to reduce the nominal value of their debt by hyperinflating it away.
Yeah, so I was going to ask that question because what country was it? Was it Venezuela that
most recently, yeah,
that saw all of that inflation? Did that government ever default?
Oh yeah.
Well, actually, I'm not sure if they didn't. They have a different. They went through terrible times, though. I don't know if you remember seeing the footage. Of people going through dumpster trucks and whatever. People making purses out of banknotes. People making literal clothing out of banknotes in order to trade it for something of value.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if they defaulted or not. Venezuela is a communist, terrible, terrible country. So I'm not sure if they actually did default, but pretty much the equivalent of now that people don't actually trade in that currency at all and have zero faith in it.
So I'm not saying we should become Venezuela. That's not my recommendation.
I don't think Micah thought that's what you were saying.
But the question is, and I've heard this argument, and it's not an argument I agree with, but I want to pose it to you to hear your response. Why can't the government inflate their way out of the debt? Meaning, let's just say for the purpose of a round number, Canada's debt is $1 trillion. Well, if you inflate the currency so far that a loaf of bread is worth $1 trillion, it becomes rather easy to pay the debt off. Why is that not actually realistic?
Because you'll destroy confidence in the currency in the process. And what is required for a currency to be successfully adopted as the unit of exchange is for there to be confidence in its ability to store value and to provide a means of transacting amongst individuals. So if you have
Let me try to put it in simpler terms and see if you agree, Micah.
Yeah.
People give money there. Money is supposed to represent something real. So we sell our money for our time, right? And I say to you, I value an hour of my time at X, right? And then you say, okay, I agree with that, and I'll pay you X. But if I no longer believe that the thing you're giving me has value, then I'm not going to be willing to exchange in it.
Well, you'll want something else. Like we heard of NBA players and people wanting to get paid in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Right. And I think here's the thing is, if you are highly leveraged and you can afford your interest payments over the next 10 years, while they probably go back to what they were for our parents in the 80s, and let me make that clear, I think before the decade is up, we are going to be back in the 12 to 15 or 20% interest rate. I'm talking on all loans. And that'll be because we're experiencing, they've printed so much money and there's UBI and there's helicopter money everywhere and everyone's a millionaire, that they will have to raise rates to get to that point. But if you can't maintain your interest payments on your house, you're probably going to default. And we're actually going to see a lot of this with so much of the housing sector being people who are over leveraged and on variable rates for probably the next 5 years or so.
Yeah.
If they cannot afford their mortgage payments, they're going to want to get out with their, they're not going to want to lose their shirts. So they're going to put their house on the market.
Think about it this way. You have $1 million home and interest rates go up 3%.
Oh,
Now you're
3%,
36,000 more a year.
5%, 10%. Like we're going to see, especially for people who are actually on variable rates, we're going to see them go up very fast. The rate of change is going to surprise many and default many. We're going to see record bankruptcies. So unless you can afford your increasing mortgage payments, you're going to put your house on the market so you can get out with your shirt. That's going to actually create more supply than we're used to and drive down prices. But if you can hang tight and allow the government to essentially create hyperinflation and reduce the nominal value of your household debt. So like $1 million mortgage is now, I mean, what I basically make in a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's in an optimistic scenario where wages actually go up with it, which I don't expect. So you are going to see certain people benefit from having their house and the mortgage on their house just completely evaporated. But the tough thing is that between now and then, they're going to have to be able to either fix their mortgage rate for 10 years and pay it off, and be able to, fix it at a rate that that allows them to continue paying that same rate. And that's what I'm going to do when we buy again, probably in a year or two, like at the bottom of the bust. So I don't, that doesn't answer your question directly, but basically, yes, inflating away the nominal value of the currency and of debts is good for debt holders. It's horrible for savers, and it's horrible for people who
have
are low and middle class, who can't afford goods and don't have enough money to basically put food on the table anymore.
Because historically speaking, you wouldn't see income rise as quickly as inflation. Correct?
Well, it can't, because like what really all this stuff is measuring is value, right? And that's why I think Mike is saying if you can hold on to your house and get through these interest rates, a house is still going to have value, like gold. It's like you have a house.
Because it's real.
Yeah, because it's real. Because money should be a reflection of reality. And I think that's why Mike is saying that the precious metals are so valuable, because they are real and tangible, and they're there and they have uses, and we know how much there is.
And this gets me back to, like, the government says, oh, we're going to do something about housing and housing affordability. They have created this situation, the lowering of interest rates and the expansion of the debt. And literally you have the Bank of Canada has a bunch of mortgage-backed securities with all the big five banks. Their balance sheet requires the housing market to continue to go up because they own the underlying assets. They do not want housing market to go down, because then that actually screws over the Bank of Canada's balance sheet. But they have allowed this to happen. I mean, a house, in my opinion, is not an investment. It's literally a place to put your head down. It's that the speculative mania over the last 20 years or 15 years, particularly in Vancouver, has been caused by government policies. And yes, there's other factors at play, like, low inventory and what have you. But we are going to end up in a place where your house is worth something, because it is a hard asset. It'll be worth something in that next currency after this one fails. It will be worth probably a shitload of money of whatever the next currency is when the currency fails. But, and look, inflation is great for house prices if you own. It's terrible if you don't. But if you don't own a house, you should not be focused on buying one. You literally should not be focused on buying one. You should be focused on protecting yourself from what's to come. And I actually rent now happily, knowing that I don't have to deal with taxes or any of that stuff. But the housing sector is going to be really interesting to watch, because in a hyperinflationary environment, yes, your house is going up like crazy, but people can barely transact because prices are going up so much. And again, I don't know who's going to be buying when there is, or if they are buying, sure, but prices are not necessarily going to go well for you if you are trying to sell your house to get rid of it at any cost because you can't afford your mortgage payments, even though the price of the house is going up, right? And if everybody's doing that, then that's sort of gonna drive prices down. So I don't think that real estate is going to be a good shelter for inflation. I think it's
in the
going to
short
just,
term, I guess.
in the shorter term, if you own, and like I said, can fix yourself for a 10-year rate that you can afford no matter what, and you can end up on the other side with it, with your house also, along with your metals being revalued in that new currency, you'll probably be a very wealthy person.
So next question then. What are the dangers? You're anticipating basically a one centralized currency globally. What are the dangers of that? And what does that mean for the future of Canada, who doesn't have gold reserves?
We will be basically at the mercy of the G20. I unfortunately think that we will be bargaining with our natural resources, both our mines, which by this time our mines will be nationalized. And again, you heard it here first, we will have a nationalized mining sector probably before the end of the decade, especially with a liberal government in place, or an NDP government, or a socialist government. But here's the thing, like even the Conservatives, who I voted for, I have no confidence that they can. We are on this trajectory so firmly that if O'Toole had become our prime minister, he could not do a thing about it. The debt we have is unrepayable at this point. We are already committed to the turn. We are turning down this path. So the dangers of a singular digital currency that comes from like the World Bank is that it likely will be, not likely, it will be much easier to control the population more than it already is. And we've seen control and the abuse of constitutional rights and the obliteration of many freedoms in COVID times. And I think that unfortunately, the worst of totalitarian government moves and control are still yet to come. Like I said, I see them actually nationalizing a lot of our mines and stuff like that, but I also see them having to bargain with rights to our natural resources in order to have a seat at the table for all the other central banks and all the other countries in the G20 that actually have respectable gold reserves. I mean, one policy, if I were Aaron O'Toole, that I would push is, fuck it, I'll go into $1 trillion of debt right now, but with that money that I'm going to print, I'm going to buy gold. And I'm going to buy gold for the country's protection. Ultimately, I'm going to have this one die too soon, but hopefully.
Okay. Well, we're reaching the end here, but man, I love talking to you about this, Micah, because you're just so knowledgeable on it.
And I'm sorry, it's a bit dark, but trust me, I don't like that. I don't like it either. I'm preparing for my family to come out of it as best we can. And I'll help anybody kind of get right with their situation to do the same.
Yeah. So for closing then, summarize for us just really cleanly once again, what would you be doing as a Canadian tomorrow?
To prepare for this, yeah.
Yeah. If I'm right in anything that I say, where we will see, ultimately a hyperinflationary sovereign debt crisis towards the end of this decade and going into the next, what I would do is urge you to consider a significant portion of any investable assets that you have be liquidated into cash in order for you to have a position in the metals. And the metals will not only perform in terms of price, like the price action I expect in the next few years will surprise many to the upside. But more importantly, it's not about what it's worth in the money unit that we transact in. It's about what it's going to do for allowing your quality of life to be preserved and for you to have wealth in the next currency when we eventually get through the other side of the fourth turning. And what that revaluation for the metals will mean, I'm not exactly sure, but I know that you'll be okay if you have some. Now, I would simply leave it with that in saying that the cheapest and most important asset to own for what's to come are gold and silver, but in particular, there has never been a better time to own physical silver than now.
Okay, great. Where can people go if they want to further their education?
That's a great question. Twitter, I have a whole bunch of people that I follow who are way smarter than me and that have actually over the years taught me what I have now pieced together as my thesis. And, the fact that you can go and listen to some of the best macroeconomists in the world for free on Twitter is super underrated. So I recommend to folks with access to Twitter to look up these few people that are really great. I can maybe make a list available of people that I follow.
We'll link it in the show notes, guys.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes when you if you have a list of those. Yeah, for
great.
The listeners.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, sounds great.
Well, this has been.
And if you are interested in the metals, you can also get a hold of Micah, and he can there's a number of people that he knows that he can direct you to as well.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of reliable suppliers in the US as well as here. And where I do all of my physical metals investing is with a company based out of Vancouver here. So they can roll over a portion of your RRSP, which is then going toward physical gold and silver, which is then vaulted. You can't take possession of it right away because you could circumvent tax benefits and stuff. But you can take possession of it later on when you would normally take possession of. So that is a great way to use money in your RSP to buy physical metals that are going to be vaulted for when you retire. Hopefully that's 10 or 20 years from now when those metals will be worth a lot more in whatever currency we transact in next.
Awesome. All right. Well, Micah, thank you very much for coming on. A little bit of a warning for people to pay attention to what's going on. I think one of the most exciting things about what Micah says is just the raw math on silver. It's once you see how undervalued silver is, you realize there's absolutely no way that this is not the play of a century. Regardless of what happens.
It's the next Bitcoin. Watch in 22, it'll perform the way that Bitcoin did in 2020 to 21, where it went from 4,000 to 6,000 or 60,000? 65,000?
Yeah, 60, 65 now or something.
the price action of silver will resemble the price action of Bitcoin.
I completely agree. And thank you for taking the time to share that with the listeners.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, no, this was fun.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.